Hi everyone, welcome back to Life Technologies YouTube channel and thank you for watching and supporting us. So this is a continuation of our IPRAN training series, and in our last two episodes we have discussed how to deploy services on IPRAN network. We discussed the SRAN solution that enables service providers to deploy different radio access technologies like 2G, 3G, 4G and 5G into one hardware. So they don't have to acquire separate hardwares for different technologies. You know that with separate hardware, you need to factor in the powering of the devices and even extra space to accommodate them in your data center. Especially when you are renting space, it means you need to rent more space or extra space for the extra hardware. So all this comes at an extra cost on the service providers. So combining the different radio access technologies into one hardware help to save cost, and also it enhances scalability for service provider networks. In our last episode, we discussed how to segment mobile services into separate VRFs or VPN instances and transport them on a common IPRAN transmission network. So we segment our services or we classify them into different or separate VRFs, and then we can be able to transport them on our IPRAN network. So in this episode, we'll be discussing how to do IP address and VLAN planning for mobile services. So when you are deploying services, especially the mobile services, you always have to, one, you need an IP address, and two, you need a VLAN. So remember I've mentioned that with SRAN solution, we have one connection from the BTS to the CSG. So it means on the CSG, we will do service configuration on the same port. So when you are doing the VLAN and IP address planning, you need to ensure that you don't have duplicate, especially for the same service. So once you have established your connection, you need to do the configurations on the CSG and the BTS. So there are some key concepts that we need to consider. And the first one is, how many usable IP addresses do we need? So this one will be determined based on the number of IP addresses you need on the BTS, and then we can choose the subnet that we'll be using for the IP addresses. So many times I've seen us using /29, which gives us 6 usable IP addresses. And even when you are doing the deployment of the services, you also need to consider the future of the network. So you should have some reserved IP addresses that you can use in future when you are doing expansion. So you will always have to assign an IP address block or a subnet for every service. So you will assign an IP address block for 2G, another one for 3G, another one for 4G. And remember, 4G we had signaling and data, and then you also need O&M. So O&M will be the one used for managing the sites. So you need to ensure that you have these IP address blocks for these different services, and they should be enough depending on the number of IP addresses that you need to configure on the BTS. And then from these IP addresses, you also need to have the gateway. So the gateway is always configured on the CSG. So you need to have an IP address plan for the gateway, and the gateway should be from the same subnet. So when you are doing the configuration on the CSG, you always have to ensure that the mask or the subnet should be configured correctly. So once you have assigned IP address, you also need VLANs. So the number of VLANs depends on how you have segmented your services. For example, if you have O&M, 2G, 3G, you have S1MME for signaling, and then you have S1U for 4G data, you also need to assign a VLAN for every service. And this VLAN should not be duplicate, especially when you are doing configuration on the same port. Remember, when we create sub-interfaces, you cannot have two separate sub-interfaces with the same VLAN. So you always have to do proper planning for the IP address and the VLANs. Another thing that you need to know is where to configure the gateway for different technologies. So on IPRAN, we normally configure the gateway on the CSG. So the port connected to the BTS will be the one where we configure the gateway for these different services, and then we can propagate them from the CSGs to the ASGs to the RSGs. So in our next slide, we'll see an example of IP and VLAN planning. So you can see that we have the services. So first you need to classify your services, know which VRFs you will be having on your network and which service will be in which VRF. So we have O&M, we have MME, we have user, we have purpose, we have IUB. Sometimes you may have multiple basebands, so you will end up having O&M 1, O&M 2, O&M 3. You can also have multiple basebands for maybe 2G or 3G, so you end up having IUB1, IUB2. So you need to have VLANs and IP addresses for all these different services. So from these, you can see that we have O&M assigned VLAN 1000, MME 1001, user 1002, and BAPIS and IUB all assigned separate or different VLANs. And you also need to assign subnets. So many times we plan separate or different subnets for different services. So you can see for O&M we are using 1090.0.0 mask is 29, and then we need to assign the gateway that will be configuring on the CSG. So you will have gateway for these different services, you will have VLANs for different services, you will have IP address for different services, and then the remaining IP address, of course, they are configured on the BTS end. So this is just a sample, but always pay attention to the VLAN and the subnets. You don't need them to be duplicates. So the next and the final stage of this episode will be how do we do service configuration on IPRAN. So the first step that we need to do is to ensure that we have a connection between the CSG and the BTS. So we need to have a port on the CSG that will be connecting to the BTS. So we select a 1G port, it could be a 10G port depending on the requirement. And once we have identified the port, the next stage is to do physical patching between the BTS and the CSG and ensure that the port is up. So the port between the CSG and the BTS should be patched and up. Once it's up, we now move to the third stage. We create sub-interfaces with the planned VLAN. So normally we use sub-interfaces, so it allows us to configure all these different services on the one port. So we'll create sub-interfaces for different services using the planned VLAN. And the fourth step is to bind the VRF. So remember, we are carrying our services through VRFs. So we need to bind these separate or these different VRFs on these sub-interfaces that we have created for the different technologies. So once you have assigned or bind the VRF, you need to assign IP address on the interface. It's always good to assign the IP address after binding the VRF, because if you do it the other way, you will have to reconfigure the IP address. So we always bind the VRF and then assign IP address. So once we have assigned the IP address that is planned, remember the IP address and VLAN should be as per the plan. We configure QoS, quality of service, which is a key topic that we'll be discussing in the coming episodes. And we also need to enable statistics on the sub interface. Remember, we need to monitor these ports. We need to know how much traffic is coming in from the BTS and even how much traffic is coming in from the controllers to the BTS. So that is the essence of enabling statistics on the sub interfaces. So we do enable statistics on the physical interface and also on the sub interface. Once you have enabled statistics, the final stage is now to perform service verification. So you need to know to verify that you are able to learn MAC address from the BTS. So you can use ARP to check whether you are able to learn the point-to-point IP connection between the BTS and the CSGs. And once you have done that, you can even try to ping from the CSG to the BTS and verify that you have connectivity between them. And now you can move to the next stage of advertising these routes. So in our next episode, we'll be doing demonstration on how to configure services, mobile services on IPRAN network. We'll set up a lab for this and demonstrate step by step on how to configure the services on IPRAN network. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in our comment section. And also remember to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more upcoming videos. Thank you.